Everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. A while ago I talked about my novella Hong Kong Dangerous for the All About That Book series that I'm working on. Today we're going to move on to The Reluctant Detective, which is the first novel in the series. You can see a blow up of the cover over my shoulder there. It's my wife's desk you see behind me. I also have the book right here. This came out in October of 2017, so as I record this in January of 2020, that's over 2 years ago. This is still my best-selling book. People still find the series this way, and it makes sense because it is number one. At this time, it's the only one that's available in audio, although I am working on number two. That is in production at the moment. So I want to share some tidbits and interesting things about the book. It is the first in the series, but it's not the first that I wrote. Several years ago for NaNoWriMo, I decided to write a novel with C.T. Ferguson as the protagonist. And I'd written probably, 15 or so short stories to that point. And they were of varying quality, let's say. Most of them were not very good. But they were exercises in finding the character's voice and things like that. So they were good for developing the character and developing his world. So I challenged myself one year to write a novel. Could I take him from 5,000 words to 75,000 words? And I wrote a novel that I tentatively called 28 Years Later. No, it wasn't a zombie or a pandemic book, although you might think so from the name. And then I moved on to write another novel, which would eventually, parts of it would eventually get repurposed into the novella Red City Blues. And then I realized, well, I have two, and I've never really talked about how this character got started, so maybe I should go back and tell the story of his first case. And I had written a short story which I very cleverly called The First Case. I'm really good at titles. And I used that kind of as the springboard for this. It was much, much shorter, but the very, very basic elements of it were the same. And that turned into the novel The Reluctant Detective. So then I thought, well, great, I have 3 novels. And I kept going. Before I published, I wrote a few more. I eventually realized that 2 and 3, 28 years later, and what I think I was still calling Red City at the time, were not very good. So I ended up not using them. But the benefit of writing those first 2 books was they were kind of practice novels, I guess, for the series, and The Reluctant Detective was good enough to publish, and I did publish that in October of 2017. And 28 years later has not ever seen the light of day. I might still come back to that story and revisit it and rewrite it, basically. Although Red City did, parts of that got repurposed into Red City Blues, which is the 3rd novella in the series. And I might cover the novella separately. So C.T.'s apartment in this building is near where my wife and I got married, in Fells Point, the Fells Point area of Baltimore. And when we were at our venue, I remember looking out from the pier to our left and seeing this large apartment building and thinking, it'd be pretty neat to live there, or to have a character who lives there. And so when it came time to give CT a place to live, I didn't want him to have a house right away. I remember that apartment, and that's where he lives for the first book. By the time the second book comes around, he is out of the apartment and does have a house. But for the first book, he is an apartment dweller, and it's right in Fells Point near where my wife and I got married. As this was technically my 3rd novel that I'd written, but the first in the series, I didn't write it with an outline. You might be able to tell at various points that there was no outline involved. I wouldn't learn the joys of outlining and the benefits of outlining until a couple books later. So Gloria, who becomes C.T.'s love interest later in the series, is introduced in this book. Kind of a soft intro. She had been in the short stories, but this was establishing the world, so I needed to show how they first met. And that is captured in the book, how they first met and their first few conversations. They don't really have much of a relationship at this point. They're just talking. By the time we get to The Confessional, the first novella set a couple months later, they have begun, as C.T. calls it, a relationship of fun and convenience. And in this book, in The Reluctant Detective, the reporter Jessica Weber is the romantic interest. And she does reappear later in the series, not as a love interest at that point, but as a reporter. She reappears in the novel Inside Cut, which I'll talk about in a later video. So CT's cousin Rich begins this book as a uniformed police sergeant, although it's pretty clear he's on the fast track. In all the short stories I wrote, he was already a plainclothes detective. So again, establishing the world, I wanted to show him progressing into that stage of his career. So he kind of begins that path in this book, and in all the books that follow, he is a plainclothes detective. And the other story characters, the supporting characters like Tony Rizzo and Joey, they all appeared in the short stories as well. So they get introduced here. So the world is pretty fully established. There are some additional characters that will come into the later books that we'll meet, but this book, there are some things I probably wish I had done better with it. But one of the things I think I did pretty well is establish most of the characters and their relationships to CT. And maybe that's rewarded by the fact that it's still my highest seller. I don't know. I'm happy that it is. So that's what I have for this video. Those are the tidbits for The Reluctant Detective. I will come back later and talk about other books in the series, so stay tuned for those. Have a good day.